Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. We'll get started in just a couple minutes. For interpretation services, if folks want to take a look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, we have both of those available if you want to get those things started. Wonderful. Okay. Great to see everyone. Alrighty, I think we're going to get things started. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Hope you all are having a good Wednesday and a good last day of July. And for folks who are experiencing smoke and wildfire impacts and all the things that are seeming to converge during this middle of summer, middle of wildfire season, definitely want to acknowledge that as well. But excited to see everyone here and welcome to our series about Forest Service grants and agreements and our first introductory session about understanding and navigating the Forest Service. My name is Emery Cowan, pronoun she, her, and I work with the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network and the Watershed Research and Training Center, and I'm part of the team behind today's webinar. Before we dive in, I wanted to take a couple minutes to go through some of our Zoom reminders. First of all, we will have the chat box turned off for our audience today to minimize distractions for our speakers, but we will be sharing links through the chat, so keep an eye out for that throughout the webinar. We do have the Q&A for folks to submit questions at any time during our presentation today. And then we'll have dedicated Q&A time at the end where we'll be able to relay that to all of our speakers. We are grateful to have Nick and Damon and Natalia here today who are providing Spanish language and ASL interpretation. And both of those are available in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen, as is closed captioning. And as a last kind of point, this recording or the webinar will be recorded, and we will send that out to all registrants and also be posting it on our website and YouTube channels. So no worries if you have to dip early or if you know someone who wanted to attend this webinar or couldn't make it. We will be sharing those recordings shortly. Alrighty. So folks aren't familiar with our organizations. The Watershed Research and Training Center is a community-based organization located in Trinity County, California. The Watershed Center works on a broad range of land and watershed stewardship efforts at local and regional scales. I think at last count, the organization had 140 open projects, so a lot going on in the Northern California area. Our staff also work on regional partnerships and a number of different capacity building efforts around biomass, workforce development, forest and wildfire resilience. And then another aspect of our work is to be involved in a number of different partnerships and networks at various scales that work to promote resilience and connections between people and communities and landscapes. And that's really where FACNet's work comes in. The Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network is stewarded by the Watershed Center and funded through a collaborative partnership between the Watershed Center, the Nature Conservancy, the Forest Service, and the Department of the Interior. And our work is really focused around supporting and connecting people and communities across the country that are working on some aspect of community or many aspects of community wildfire resilience, from preparedness to adaptation to recovery. And so that includes providing and sharing resources, tools, learning opportunities, peer connections to really help foster and expand thoughtful, creative, equity-focused approaches to community wildfire adaptation. And for today's presentation and series, we're really excited to be hosting this. We know that the Forest Service plays an important role and is rolling out a lot of funding opportunities in the natural resources and wildfire and climate resilience space. That's really core to our organizations and our networks and a lot of the partners who we engage with. And so we hope that this webinar series can provide a starting point or kind of a knowledge boost for communities that are interested in exploring or deepening their partnerships or funding relationships with the agency. So as a quick overview of where we are and where we're headed, this is a three-part series. The goal for today is really to provide a high-level orientation to the agency, some of the budgetary and policy drivers that are influential to its work with partners, and then some updates and considerations and opportunities for entities interested in engaging with the Forest Service in some way. When we were kind of brainstorming the series, we really wanted to have this like foundational kind of grounding session for folks who have less experience engaging with the Forest Service, may not know the full scope of work of the agency or its structure, how it operates. So we're really grateful for generous private donors who helped us kind of make this vision of an initial session a reality. Next up, over the coming 2 weeks, we have a second session that's really going to home in on the grants and agreements tools that the agency uses and some of those functions and features of those tools, as well as some new efforts that the agency is undertaking to make especially the suite of non-competitive agreement tools in its toolbox more accessible to partners. So that one is coming up next Thursday. And then our third session is diving into what it looks like to put these grants and agreements tools into practice with a really awesome panel of Forest Service and nonprofit leaders who have a lot of experience with a range of these tools. So they're going to be sharing some of their insights and takeaways and kind of walking us through the process. And that webinar is coming up in a couple of weeks. So if you want to register for those, the QR code is here on the screen, or my colleague David is going to be putting those links in the chat box. And just as a final note, those two latter sessions are supported by our partnership with the Forest Service and several other nonprofit organizations on a new Community Navigator initiative, and that aims to help build the capacity of communities to connect with Forest Service funding and partnership opportunities. So really in line with this series in general. And we will, for folks interested in learning more, my colleague Terestia O'Reilly will be providing a quick overview of that initiative and some of the resources and services that we provide. So now I'm going to hand things over to our Forest Service presenters. We have Maya Bhattori, Partnership Coordinator with the National Partnership Office, Chris Farley, Deputy Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act Coordinator for State, Private, and Tribal Forestry, and Tasha Caldwell, Assistant Director for External Engagement with the Forest Service's Office of Tribal Relations. So big thanks to them for being willing to be on this webinar. And I will hand it over to them.
Thanks, Emery. And hello, everyone. I am Maya Bhattori. As Emery said, I'm a partnership coordinator in the Forest Service's National Partnership Office. So during the next 45 minutes or so, I'm going to cover the following topics with my colleague, Chris Farley and Tasha Caldwell. As Emery mentioned, this webinar is part of a series, and this session is only intended to provide a high-level overview of the Forest Service's mission, activities, structure, and partnership opportunities. So in the coming sessions, you'll learn more about the specifics on how to engage in the grants and agreements process and tips for success. We'll end today with plenty of time for Q&A, so please add your questions to the Q&A box or save them for the end. Next slide, please. So I'm going to start off by describing the Forest Service mission, structure, and activities, including our partnership activities. Next slide. So the Forest Service was created over 100 years ago with the goal of regulating public lands. Our founder, Gifford Pinchot, had a utilitarian mindset, thinking, how can the forest be managed to promote the greatest good for the greatest number over the long term? And over time, the agency's mission has broadened, and we now balance timber, range, water, recreation, and wildlife resource management. But our value of sustainability has endured, and our mission today is at the top there. It's to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. So we're much more than just public lands. As you can see from the bullets on this slide, we have a broad range of activities. We manage natural resources like seed cultivation in nurseries, and we develop advanced products like man-use cellulose and industrial infrastructure supports. We have a large research arm that investigates the social, economic, and environmental impacts of our agency and provides technical assistance abroad on wildfire management. We run competitive grant programs, and we work with state governments, local governments, tribes, private landowners, and industry to protect and manage non-federal land and associated range and watershed. We even advise on international policy and administer law enforcement and emergency services. To serve the nation as our mission directs us to, we interact with myriad groups, from hikers to loggers to oil developers to air quality regulators. And so, as I hope you're starting to see, we have a very broad mission, which enables us to collaborate on a variety of work on and off our lands. Let's go to the next slide. So what do I mean when I say on or off our lands? So the Forest Service has presence from Alaska to Puerto Rico, and we're divided into 9 geographic regions as shown on this map here. We manage 154 national forests and 20 grasslands through a network of ranger districts at the most local level, supervisors' offices, and regional offices. These lands compose the National Forest System, and there are several national forests in each region. Our headquarters are in Washington, D.C., and that's the hub for national program management and policy. We also have 5 research stations that are located throughout the country, and these research stations overlap and focus their research on one or more regions, but also do work and studies outside of their geographic boundaries, sometimes internationally. One aspect of the Forest Service that's helpful for our partners to know is that we operate as a highly decentralized agency with substantial discretion and authority given to local line officers at the station or region, forest, and district levels. Staff areas, for example, wildlife experts, grants and agreements liaisons, etc., report to these line officers rather than subject matter experts at the next higher level, like the headquarters. So where there is policy discretion or flexibility, regional differences may occur, and this is especially pertinent for the grants and agreements process. There may be differences in the preferred approach and instruments, which we'll discuss more in later sessions. So let's go to the next slide. So this is an overview of our headquarters. So within our headquarters, also known as the Washington office, we have 4 different deputy areas, each led by a deputy chief. We have, from the left to the right, state, private, and tribal forestry, national forest system, research and development, and business operations. We have some cross-deputy programs as well, such as law enforcement, legislative affairs, the Office of Communication, and international programs. These programs focus on topics that cut across our various deputy areas. And now I'll dig into each of these deputy areas and what they're really up to. So starting from the left, state, private, and tribal forestry includes our fire and aviation management and the Office of Tribal Relations, which support all deputy areas in tribal engagement and policy. Some other cross-deputy programs that we'll talk more about, specifically my colleague Chris Farley will talk more about in state private tribal forestry, include forest health protection, which deals with invasives and pests across land ownerships, and conservation education, which supports staff from all deputy areas in engaging with youth. And to note here, state private tribal cooperative forestry and grant programs generally work at the regional or Washington office level, and staff are co-located in regional offices or research stations. The wildfire programs have significant overlap with both the national forest system and emergency coordination in response to different levels of response from our agency. So National Forest System is what most people think of or know of the Forest Service, and this is 193 million acres of public lands with over 160 million visitors each year. So the National Forest System Deputy Area includes the National Partnership Office, where I sit, the Office of Sustainability and Climate, and a new policy office, which serves the whole agency. Research and Development is the world's largest natural resource science organization with over 300 principal investigator scientists. It includes world-renowned institutions like the Forest Products Labs in Wisconsin, the Missoula Fire Lab, and the International Institute of Tropical Forestry in Puerto Rico. And business operations includes all the supporting program management, strategic planning, HR, financial management, and other functions, including grants and agreements policy. And the Albuquerque Service Center is a hub for business operations work. And I want to take a moment to talk about the Albuquerque Service Center, since some of you may be familiar with it through your invoicing processes. So these processes that the Albuquerque Service Center, or ASC, manages are separate from anything your grants and agreement specialist or program manager can affect, like paying out invoices. But your program manager is your best point of contact if you have questions. And during the G&A session, the grants and agreement session coming up, you'll learn more about the responsibilities of each of our staff. Next slide, please. Okay, so clearly the Forest Service has a broad geographic mission and mission scope, but what does that mean for partnerships? How are our partnerships different from partnerships in other sectors and agencies? Well, we're required by law to manage public lands, so that means our mission and scope is pretty stable. We're not beholden to a bottom line and instead adjust priorities based on administrations, and these adjustments are often slow moving. However, being part of the government, we often have lengthy processes during bureaucracy and stricter reporting requirements. And what sets our agency apart from some others is our multi-use mandate. The Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960 stated that the National Forest must balance multiple uses of the land, including recreation, timber, range, watershed, and fish and wildlife purposes. As stated in our mission, sustainability is key, and sustainability inherently involves trade-offs, so no single use gets priority. This is a broader scope than other agencies, and something we'll dive in more into the coming slides. We do a lot more than cut trees or clear trails. We also have several different mechanisms for partnership depending on the location and type of work being done. These mechanisms were enabled by Congress for the Forest Service and are called partnership authorities. And our challenge cost share agreement is very common in our agency versus the Park Service, for example. And that agreement type enables a broad variety of work to happen. Next slide. So our partnerships can range widely to accommodate our broad mission and our geographic scope. I want to note that not all partnerships are formalized through partnership agreements, which are like contracts and negotiated between organizations and the agency. Organizations can collaborate with the agency informally through citizen science initiatives or collaboratives, and we'll talk more about that in a future slide. But projects can span from urban and community forestry to workforce development to conservation education, research, to cooperative assistance for international bird migration, and much more. We engage with all age groups and demographics and participate in activities from youth engagement to data collection. So I hope through this portion you've found out that we're more than just trees or wildlife or trails. We have a broad scope and broad geography that enables a wide variety of work. So let's go to the next slide. This is where I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Chris, to talk more about guiding factors for our activities and partnerships.
Thanks, Maya. So yeah, as Maya talked about, we really are this kind of huge organization that can kind of address natural resources from the planting and research on individual seeds to the wood products that are produced on the back end, and kind of how that all comes together is often driven by our kind of authorities and other factors. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more. We can go to the next slide. So because we are a government organization, of course, kind of the thing that largely drives us initially is those federal laws and regulations that both constrain what we can do as an agency, and then also if you engage in partnerships with us, can set requirements and constraints on our partners. And so kind of a fundamental first one on that is appropriations law. So Congress decides what programs and what laws we follow and how much money we have to pursue those actions. And it's a dollar is not a dollar when you're talking about federal government spending. So funding that Congress gives us has to be spent on those programs that Congress set for those dollars. And we have limited discretion to kind of move money from one program to another. And so that can sometimes be a constraint when we're kind of trying to fit into the gray areas between programs. But this is a really core consideration that we often have in the Forest Service, because this is one of the few areas where kind of federal employees can be prosecuted and go to jail if we spend money on the wrong things. And so you'll sometimes hear federal employees talk about the color of money. And that's really kind of what is the purpose of that money that Congress gave us for, and are we spending it on those kind of authorized purposes? When we talk about kind of partnerships and kind of funds that are available for partner organizations or communities, a lot of our competitive grant programs are highly oversubscribed. So when we have a notice of funding opportunity to give money out to communities or organizations, we typically get in 3 to even 10 times as many applications as we have money to be able to fund. And that's been even true with the large amounts of supplemental funding we've had in the last couple of years from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act programs. So that's kind of that big picture of kind of the money we have is for specific purposes. Once we are working in those purposes, then we have the general bureaucracy of the federal government, which is like the federal acquisition regulations and the procurement rules that we have when we're buying services. And so those rules in the regulations establish kind of what we must do to either provide funding for competitive or also our non-competitive awards. And then also establish those requirements that are put on recipients of federal funds. For instance, audits and reporting requirements, civil rights obligations, those sorts of things. And that can include things like limits on applicable travel costs or meeting expenses. So, for example, sometimes it's difficult for Forest Service dollars to be used on food. And that can create issues. For instance, some cultures, a lot of tribal cultures often are very kind of hospitality focused, and federal dollars often are difficult to use for some of those purposes. Because of those broader, and it's not just the Forest Service, those federal acquisition rules apply to the federal government as a whole, but those broader rules. Then as kind of we step down from those kind of regulations that kind of all federal agencies have to deal with, we have specific statutes and rules for the Forest Service ourselves. And so those are often described in our Forest Service handbook and manual. If anybody has ever looked at that, they are thousands and thousands of pages that kind of describe how we're supposed to do our work as federal employees and in the different programs we have. And so kind of, I would not kind of, if you want a good set of reading to put yourself to sleep at night, maybe that's a good way to do that. But I would not necessarily encourage folks to dive into the Forest Service handbook and manual, but those do set kind of more specific requirements that flow from those laws and regulations that we have. And that's either departmental guidance or Forest Service specific guidance. And then as we kind of go down from kind of our national level handbook and guidance, we do have kind of forest. And as Maya said, we decentralize a lot of our work to individual forests and individual forest leaders. And so one of a key set of documents that often describes how we do that management of those federal lands is through our forest planning process. And so with that, we have some fairly robust rules around how the forest must engage with their community and get input into their plans. And then kind of those plans set a lot of the priorities for that local area work. And so those plans are supposed to be renewed every 10 years because of litigation and lots of other things. That has not always been the case. And some of those plans have sat kind of in place for 30 years in some cases. No one, I think, thinks that's a good idea. But kind of we're trying to work through kind of updating those plans and also dealing with a lot of the new things we're seeing, like large-scale fire or invasive species disturbances that require amendments to those plans. Next slide, please. So we talked a little bit about kind of how Congress gives us different funding, and that funding really comes in three different ways. The first and most common is what we call annual appropriations. So each year, Congress passes an appropriations bill that sets aside funding for each of the programs in the Forest Service. And that's done on an annual basis and is guided by the laws and authorities that Congress has given us. And so an example of this is every year the Forest Service gets money to do hazardous fuels treatments on and around both federal and non-federal land, actually. So that's kind of, but each year we're going to get a steady amount. We don't exactly know what that amount is going to be each year. Congress can change that, but each year we generally expect that we're going to get an amount of money for those programs. In the last few years, we've had a large influx of what we call supplemental funding. And so this is additional funding that's on top of those annual appropriations. And so the two big giant ones that we think of a lot is the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that had hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars, about 11 billion total actually between the two laws to supplement those annual appropriations for different programs that we have. And in some cases, establish new authorities or programs. And so that has taken up a lot of priority in our agency in terms of both being able to deliver on that work that Congress has asked us to do, as well as it's just a huge amount where, so for instance, our urban and community forestry program used to be about a $30 to $40 million a year program. It received $1.5 billion in kind of Inflation Reduction Act. And so just expanding to do that supplemental work has been a big challenge for the agency. And then the last source of funds that we see is trust fund funding. And so this is somewhere in between. You could kind of describe it as kind of part annual appropriation, part supplemental funding. And it's guided by kind of authorized laws. And so, for instance, when we do timber harvest, a portion of the money that the Forest Service receives for the people buying that timber goes into a trust fund for reforestation. And so we then can use those trust fund dollars to go and do the reforestation work that Congress has directed us to do with the money that we collected. Another example is the Great American Outdoors Act that was passed a few years ago, maybe about 5 years ago. And that permanently authorized a bunch of actions through the Land, Water, and Conservation Fund, which takes a portion of oil revenues and a number of other kind of permit and revenue streams that the federal government gets, but it now allows the Forest Service and Department of Interior to access those funds to do different work. And so we're using a lot of that money through the Great American Outdoors Act for infrastructure and maintenance. And then also that's what things like our forest legacy grants and federal land acquisitions often use, is that Land, Water, and Conservation Fund, trust fund dollars. Next slide, please. So what is the timeline on this? Generally, we work on an annual timeline. As we said, we get annual appropriations. And the fiscal year for the federal government is October 1st to September 30th. And so in an ideal world, if you kind of look at this circle chart on kind of the right side of the screen, Congress passes a budget setting the funding levels for the year. And so that's October 1st, ideally. That has not happened. Congress has not been able to actually pass those funding bills, I think, for a couple decades now on time. And so we'll talk a little bit about the implications of that in a minute, but ideally, so the first step is Congress passes those funding levels. And then the agency and the programs would say, okay, we have this amount of money for this year, and we're going to kind of prioritize and determine how to spend those funds. And kind of when we have that, we can do that. When we don't have those appropriations from Congress on time, we can do a little of the work, but if you don't know how much money you have, sometimes it's hard to do that prioritization. And so kind of we'll see how that kind of flows through the work that we've done in the past. But then it's kind of that second step is now, once you know how much money you have, then you can prioritize it and you do it. So once we have kind of know how much money we have, we give that money out to our program staff and our grants and agreements staff, and they execute those agreements with partners. And so typically all that grant and agreement paperwork and different things needs to be submitted in the spring to early summer because we need to finish all that work before the end of the fiscal year that happens September 30th. And so kind of all that paperwork comes in the spring or early summer so that they can work through the processes to actually get that money out to the communities. And then the last step on this is kind of, it's a cycle. And so the president typically submits their budget to Congress in February, March-ish, and then Congress will evaluate kind of how they think everything's going, and they will change their legislative priorities, the overall budget. Stakeholder groups can go to their Congress people and advocate for more or less money to the different programs, and kind of we do the whole thing over again. And then we would hope that we would have those appropriations starting October 1st of the next year to do it all over again. And so kind of a key piece of this is it's often very difficult for the agency to move forward until those congressional decisions are complete. We can try to plan and prepare, but kind of we can't move without Congress. And so what we've seen in the last decade or two is what we call continuing resolutions. And these are laws passed by Congress that kind of keep the lights on and say, Forest Service, keep doing your work, but they don't actually have the final budget levels in them in a lot of cases. And so we're limited for the length of that continuing resolution to continue to work on the same planning that we'd done the year before. And so we can't really get into that step 2 and step 3 of this grant cycle. Supplemental funding, as we talked about, is kind of a different source of funding. And a lot of that doesn't require an annual appropriation each year. So for instance, Inflation Reduction Act funding, that was all given in one kind of big lump sum. And we've been kind of spending that down in annual plans over the last few years. And we will mostly spend it out in the next year or two. But that, we don't have to wait on Congress on that. When they gave that money to us initially, it had the whole thing. And so we can move on more of our own cycles for supplemental funding often. And same with trust funds. If the money's in the trust fund, we can generally move forward with the planning there. Next slide, please. So how do we do kind of those second and third steps that we talked about, which is kind of figuring out the priorities and then allocating them out to the different programs? We get our priorities from a lot of different places as an agency. So there's policy priorities that are written into the legislation, and so Congress sometimes gives us those policy priorities. The executive branch, political leadership also can give us policy priorities. And so an example of this is an executive order that the Biden administration signed that we call the Justice 40 initiative. And this requires federal agencies for particular programs to spend at least 40% of the benefits of that program going to historically underserved and marginalized communities. And so there's a tool that kind of helps identify those, and we're kind of now implementing that and making sure that our programs are matching those policy priorities. Another example could be things like the wildfire crisis strategy. That's an agency priority that we go forward with. And then we have things like the Community Navigators Initiative that we're going to talk about a little bit more, which is one of the ways we're trying to implement that policy priority for the Justice 40, which is to enhance our ability for communities to access this complex array of Forest Service programs, and especially the large funding amounts that we got in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. Another piece of that was a decision we made where we are, since 2022, are waiving match requirements for these historically underserved and disadvantaged communities where it's not absolutely required by the legislation for us to require match. So where we have that discretion, we're waiving those match requirements. And kind of the wildfire crisis strategy, if you asked our chief kind of what is his biggest thing to show kind of work, we know the wildfire crisis is a huge issue for our agency. And so moving forward on work in 21 priority landscapes that we've identified is a big priority. And we're really trying to show how enhanced investment in these local areas can actually change kind of the conditions on the ground. We don't necessarily always have money to do everything everywhere, but we're trying to show if we actually do some of this work, we can make some significant impact in these 21 priority landscapes. Next slide, please. So we'll talk a little bit about how kind of these supplemental funding dollars that we've seen has allowed us to expand our partnership capacity and opportunities. And so I think one area that we've certainly seen a lot of that growth is approximately half of the supplemental funding went to our state, private, and tribal forestry programs. Huge expansions of our competitive grant funding opportunities. Like I talked a little bit about our urban and community forestry grants. So of that $1.5 billion we received out of the IRA for that, we had a number of large funding opportunities and have largely moved a lot of that money out or awarded it. But there's still going to continue to be opportunities from the states where we moved a bunch of money to state, urban, and community forestry programs, as well as some of our pass-through partners who have created their own little sub-grant work through the Inflation Reduction Act awards they received. A new program, a new competitive grant opportunity program we have, we're calling our Forest Landowner Support Program, and it's really focused on climate and forest resilience. So these are new programs for climate change cost share opportunities, payments for carbon practices. There's currently some new notice of funding opportunities that were just announced last week by the Secretary of Agriculture for those programs, as well as some programs to help underserved and small acreage landowners access new climate and forest resilience markets. And so there's some open programs for that as well. And so those were new grant programs that didn't exist before the Inflation Reduction Act, but we're now moving forward through our cooperative forestry programs. We've often had, or we've always had kind of these wood innovations, community wood and wood or community wood grant programs. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act added new money into those programs, as well as created a new program specifically on wood products industry infrastructure. And so kind of each year we're providing grants and working with partners to develop new wood products technologies, community wood energy efforts, and infrastructure enhancements to mill and wood processing infrastructure. And so kind of those programs typically get announced every fall, and we will continue to do the enhanced and larger capacity grants that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act provided funding for. And then another new program that came out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is our Community Wildfire Defense Grant Program. And this is funding for development and implementation of community wildfire protection plans. So communities can put together a plan on how they're going to deal with fire, and then either get money to create those plans or to implement those plans once they have them. And so we're going to soon be announcing, I think, a third round of those in the next few months. Another grant opportunity for those. Now, there's a large number of other activities as well. Those are just kind of some of the big ones, but it gets very complicated. As we talked about, we do a lot of different things. And so trying to make the larger structure of the Forest Service more clear, if you know the big ones, then you can connect with the Forest Service and they can connect you to the smaller opportunities as well. And the Community Navigator initiative that we've talked a little bit about is one way we're trying to simplify that complexity for people trying to access these programs. And so I'm going to turn it over to Tasha Caldwell, one of our assistant directors for the Tribal Relations Office, and she'll talk about how specifically we work with tribes for a lot of this work.
Thank you, Chris. And so I see that you covered a lot of our existing opportunities, and definitely appreciate all your help on that. So what you're seeing on the slide here is really the structure of the Office of Tribal Relations in the Washington office. And so as you can see, it is we are modeled after the Chungleshka Wakan, which is a Lakota term meaning the sacred hoop. And that is the foundation of all things. So in that respect, we utilize that as the foundation for our Office of Tribal Relations organizational structure and how we manage and how we proceed with the work that we have. So in our vision, the sacred hoop it always must remain in balance, and so each part needs to work in connection with the other areas. So we don't operate in silos in the Office of Tribal Relations. When any part of the sacred hoop becomes weak, then we're all weak. And so with that respect, that is how we work. We also emulate many of the guiding principles, or what is known as the grandfather teachings, in the Office of Tribal Relations. And so what I'm going to describe to you is how we are organized. And as you can see, each of the 4 directions are represented here on our structure or organizational chart. However, we are led by the Black Wataya, or the Black Wataya Directorate, which is led by the director, Reed Robinson, and he is supported by Pamela Williams as his executive assistant. The next section of the Office of Tribal Relations, and probably most important to this conversation for Community Navigator communities, is the Red Wataya. And this Wataya, or this group, is led out by Alicia Bell Sheeter. And so she and her team serve as the experts, or subject matter experts, and also the shakers and the movers in facilitating co-stewardship here in the Office of Tribal Relations in the Forest Service and helping tribes in the regions and building that capacity. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The next Wataya is the Yellow Wataya, which is composed of, or is led out by Travis, excuse me, it's led out by Travis Stone. And he is supported by Amber Carrillo and Sandy Marin. And they currently, what they do is they take care of all of the Washington office, the national level policy, national level consultation items. And then you have the White Wataya, which is led out by myself, and I'm supported by Angela Pittman, tribal policy analyst, and then also tribal relations specialist Heath Bailey, and Sandy Marin is also assists and supports my team as well. And I failed to mention, I apologize for this, but additional contacts for the Red Wataya include those staff that support that Wataya, which is Melissa Cook and Rachel Novak, and of course Alicia Belsheeter. And so I know that we really just have this one slide up, but I think that there's a number of different areas that are really important and critical to this conversation. And one is not only what is guiding our work in addition to our directives and administrative policy direction, but one piece that we work on daily is the Forest Service National Tribal Relations Action Plan on tribal consultation and strengthening nation-to-nation relationships. And the purpose of this document is to provide agency direction and assistance to fulfill our federal trust responsibility, honor treaty obligations, and also to support tribal self-determination. If anybody has an inkling or would like to see what that looks like for the Office of Tribal Relations, I would encourage you to go to the Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations website. We have a number of great resources that are available to the public, and these are the same resources that we utilize in our day-to-day work as we work through work with the regions and field staff, and also as we work with the Washington office programs on a variety of different issues. And so some other resources that you're going to find on the Office of Tribal Relations website includes the Tribal Cultural and Heritage Cooperation Authority Technical Guide. And then you also will find links to the White House Council on Native American Affairs Best Practices Report for Tribal Treaty and Reserved Rights. Another important piece that is critical specifically for tribal communities and also those community navigators who are serving tribal communities is to have a good understanding not only of our policy on tribal consultation, but also on the White House. There is another resource available through the White House Council on Native American Affairs Memorandum on Uniform Standards for Tribal Consultation, and then also a new document, White House Council on Native American Affairs published an Indigenous Knowledge Guidance Implementation Memo. And this implementation memo is really important to how we look at how tribal community, or how we're showing up in tribal communities specific to forest management planning, and how we are showing up and asking for permission from the tribes to work with them on Indigenous knowledge and preserving this land, because tribes were here, have been here since time immemorial. Everywhere in this United States is tribal land. It has been at one point in time, if not currently. And so other resources that you're going to find on there also include the Joint Secretarial Order 3403, which guides a lot of our work, the 2012 Planning Rule, Forest Service Tribal Relations Manual, our directives, which is Chapter 1560, and then the Forest Service Tribal Consultation Handbook. And those are all resources, again, that are available to the public. Anybody can read them, and we ask you to hold us to what's in every one of those documents. And so I think really just to get to the meat of this conversation, I'd like to lay out just the various authorities that enable the Forest Service to enter into grants, contracts, and cooperative agreements with tribes for extraordinary consultation, any specialized expertise that incorporates traditional knowledge into restoration efforts. So one of our key authorities that was provided to the Forest Service is the Tribal Forest Protection Act of 2004. And this includes specific and special consideration for tribal related factors in co-stewardship. And this includes cultural, traditional, and historical affiliation of the tribe with the land. their Indigenous knowledge and the skills that they bring. Another important piece to know is that in the 2018 Farm Bill, the Forest Service was granted demonstration authority to enter into self-determination agreements to perform administrative, management, and other functions of programs of the Tribal Forest Protection Act under Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. It also amended the Good Neighbor Authority that included tribes and counties. And these authorities, in addition to stewardship, end result contracting, we also have the Native Act, which is the Native American Tourism and Improving Visitor Experience Act, and the Wyden Amendment. These all form a suite of authorities that the Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations utilizes to support tribal co-stewardship across the broad spectrum of tribal priorities and also Forest Service mission critical work. So some pieces that are specific to the bipartisan infrastructure law Bill provided the Forest Service with 5.4 million, roughly 5.4 billion, and the authority to tackle some of the most pressing issues. And so for tribes, what we look at here is our investment and assisting and working with tribes to make critical investments or tribal investments that reduce wildfire risk, restore healthy, productive forests, and improve environmental, recreation, and economic infrastructure. Some key points to note, and I'm just going to wrap this up real quick here, is that concerning co-stewardship, in fiscal year 23, the USDA Forest Service and tribes executed more than 120 co-stewardship agreements. These represented a total investment of approximately $68 million. You know, that was earth-shattering for us. The fiscal year 23 tribal investment more than tripled the 19.8 million that was invested in fiscal year 22. So Alicia's team and the Forest Service is absolutely rocking co-stewardship and work with tribes. These agreements, they included approximately 37 million in 12 self-determination agreements. That was up from approximately 4.3 million in fiscal year 2022. And in addition to significantly increasing the number of co-stewardship agreements, the Forest Service also made notable policy adjustments, which recognize the importance of Indigenous knowledge and providing tribes with improved access to USDA programs. If you'd like to see the annual co-stewardship report, I would also invite you to go to our Forest Service Office of Tribal Relations website. You will find that annual co-stewardship report for fiscal year 23 and fiscal year 22. And there's also a heat map for tribal investments. And so you can see the amount of money that was invested in what region and what project, what the overall goals were of that project, and also what the funding source was. And all you have to do is click on the map. You'll see various points on the map that you can pinpoint to. That gives you an idea of different ways that our office has been working with tribes and working with programs to implement co-stewardship on tribal specific projects. And so with that, I will turn this back over to my colleague, Chris.
Thank you. If we go to the next slide.
Yeah, I think
Maya will
that's
take it from there.
Yeah, to explain a bit about our office, the National Partnership Office, and then after this, we'll dig into partnership opportunities specifically. So the Partnership Office is in the National Forest System Deputy Area, and we have a goal to work across all deputy areas to strengthen and promote the agency's partnership infrastructures through our policies, programs, and personnel. And thanks for putting that link in the chat. Feel free to check out our website, which has some of this information. To that end, we work in three main areas, which we call hubs. And so in our Workforce Development Partnerships Hub, we manage several youth and professional development programs, which you can see in that left column there. And since we're at the national level, the programs our staff work on are at the national scale. So if you're part of an organization that conducts workforce development activities across the nation, you may want to learn more about this hub on our website. Our second hub has to do with special programs and interagency coordination. As we heard earlier, there's always some supplemental funding that's coming down the pipeline that we have to react to. And so the teams in this hub do that. The teams focus on the national level administration of programs in the national forest system. And we don't have grant making authority in our deputy area, unlike Chris's deputy area, the state private tribal forestry program, which is why if you're looking for grant opportunities, they're going to be coming out of his office. And our final hub is the Partnership Innovation and Agency-Wide Support Hub. And my team, specifically the Partnership Support Team, is part of this hub. And we focus on supporting the 100+ partnership coordinators that were recently brought into the agency across the country. And we also work closely with the Grants and Agreements Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch, OPE, that you'll hear from in upcoming webinars. And they provide support to partners directly. And Conservation Finance is the other program in this hub. And they work with forests to identify projects that might be ripe for innovative funding models. So I encourage you to check out our website, which has a link to an inbox that we monitor. And I also recommend using the inbox OPEGA at USDA.gov for support as well. And we'll get back to more ways to get involved directly and how to connect with our teams directly in the coming slides. So if we go to the next slide. Okay, this is where we start digging into partner engagement. So now we've talked a lot about who we are as an agency, but how do you get involved and what does that even mean? What does partnership mean? We'll dig into that in the coming slides and the Q&A. So let's go to the next slide. So engagement with the Forest Service can be broadly categorized as formal and informal, and both can be partnerships. If we're talking about a formal partnership, however, that's through some instrument like a contract, a grant, or agreement. So these all involve the exchange of money and commitment to monitoring and evaluation. So a contract is best if the relationship is generally one-sided, the agency has a need and any organization can meet that need. Contracts can be at any level of our agency and bids are open to all. Grants are offered on grants.gov and can be used when we have an authority to give them out. And partnership agreements are best if there's going to be lots of coordination between the partner and the agency. So there's joint ownership of the project, there's cost sharing, and there's mutual benefit involved. And partnerships can also happen at any level of the agency, but these can take several months to be executed. And so the informal ways to engage with our agency, and sometimes we consider these partners also, but again, this is like an informal partnership. There's no instrument or contract or agreement involved here. You can develop a memorandum of understanding, or an MOU, which is a document signed between a partner organization and agency that outlines an intention to collaborate, but does not involve any transfer of money. There are collaboratives, which may already exist locally that work together on a specific issue or project of interest. And they collaborate separately from the agency. The Forest Service has a robust citizen science program, which is when anyone contributes to the scientific process through forming research questions, collecting, analyzing, and making conclusions about data, or performing or developing new technologies and applications. Volunteering is another great way to get involved with opportunities from hosting campgrounds to answering phones to working with specialists on botany and wildlife and more. And there's also the chance to get involved with your local forest's plan revision process or other processes that involve public comment. And Chris mentioned these earlier. So those opportunities can be when your community values can be incorporated in our land management decisions by making your voice heard through forest meetings. And so these informal methods can also be a good pathway to more formal arrangements as your organization learns more about the Forest Service and vice versa. Okay, next slide. So if you're going the path of formal partnership with the Forest Service, so a partnership agreement, it's important to think about your organization's preparedness. So if you're looking to receive a grant, have you checked the eligibility criteria? If you're looking to be a contractor or partner, do you have an up-to-date sam.gov account? If you're looking to enter into a partnership agreement, mutual interest and mutual benefit is necessary, and that means there must be alignment between your organization's mission and the Forest Service's. We have a match policy that Chris touched on. It's changed in recent years and will be discussed at a future webinar, but it's important to think about if your organization has the financial and human capacity to enter into a multi-year relationship with the Forest Service, which, as we heard, operates on these sometimes unpredictable funding cycles. And finally, could you work on our timelines and with our requirements as outlined in law and policy? So just a few things to consider if you're looking at the formal partnership path. And a conversation with a partnership coordinator or local staff or the grants and agreements, outreach and partnership engagement branch can help answer some of these questions if you're unsure. So let's go to the next slide. If you feel like you are sure and feel prepared to formally engage in partnership, who do you talk to? Where do you go? First, I'd recommend identifying your focus area and geographic scope. So if you're interested in a national program, search our agency website for that program and its contact info. If you're interested in working on a project at a specific ranger district, so super local, look at that Forest website for their contact information. I'd recommend being direct in your message, mention your interest in partnership and your focus area, and don't be afraid to follow up. But if you reach a dead end, I'd recommend reaching out to the Outreach and Partnership Engagement Branch email, which is incorrect on this slide. The one in chat is correct, opega@usda.gov. And Chris is going to talk a bit about getting started with grants.
Yeah, so in terms of accessing all of those kind of grant programs, and the state private tribal forestry areas where most of the money is really transferred from the Forest Service to external partners. The National Forest System often is spending that money locally, but partnering, or often spending the money internally, but partnering with people to implement the work. Kind of the grant programs where we're actually kind of giving money out to people to do work outside those kind of National Forest System boundaries can be in the form of grants, both competitive or non-competitive grants. But it's largely the same process. It's just often a little more focused where the programs are administered. We talked kind of those state private tribal forestry programs are administered at the regional level or above in a lot of cases. And so again, kind of if you're interested in that sort of thing, you need to figure out kind of what is the focus area of the work that you want to do in your community. And then kind of what is the geographic scope? Is it going to be kind of regionally, or is it going to be in a particular forest or district or urban area or state park or wherever that is? And then because those opportunities don't have kind of the clear Forest Service local staff in a lot of cases, like the National Forest System does, it can be a little bit harder to find that relevant program contact or coordinator. And so here's where kind of we're really trying as an agency to be more accessible. And so we have community navigators now that are working through kind of these partner organizations that will know the right person to talk to, hopefully, or at least know who they can talk to find the right person. So that's an opportunity. The programs, if you know which focus area you want, the program coordinators, they can, if you contact the programs there, they can kind of find you the right person to talk to. And your partnership coordinators at the local national forest may not know exactly what that program is, but they can often direct you up to a regional contact or to someone that can help you find where you need to go there. We recognize this is not a perfect process. And we talked a little bit about the scale of growth of the competitive grant programs we have. When you're a $30 million program a year, it's a very different outreach than when you're a $1.5 billion program. And we as an agency are trying to figure out how to kind of better connect with communities on how to do that. So feedback, positive, negative, or anything in between, we're also very happy to hear. And because we're going to try to do better, and we're always trying to improve where we go from there. Next slide.
So on this slide, there's just a few links to some stories about partnerships. I think these slides will be available after the event. So there's some links here. Feel free to click around and read some of our stories to get inspired. On to the next. Okay, I think we're opening our Q&A session. Emery?
Yeah, thanks, Maya. Sorry, it took me a little bit to get off mute there. So I'm going to stop screen sharing, and if our Forest Service presenters could come back on screen, that would be great. We had some great questions in the Q&A box, and again, that's still open if folks want to pop more questions in there as we get to the ones that already came in. I'm just going to start running through these. Chris, you marked one as being able to answer live. I think we're going to start with the one we received most recently. We were talking just a lot about kind of these different funding streams and programs. Talked a lot about the Forest Service's mission expanding beyond federally managed lands. So one question that came in is asking about funds, the types of funds that can be dedicated to property off NFS lands or outside of Forest Service boundaries, wondering what those sort of funding streams and opportunities are.
Yeah, so most of our competitive grant funding programs are actually for work off of the federal lands. And so whether it's urban and community forestry, or we have a number of cooperative forestry programs that kind of can help private landowners create plans for their properties, or we have invasive species things that have cost shares and things there. A lot of those programs are run through the states. So in some cases, the Forest Service provides money to state forestry agencies that then will run their own kind of programs to then deliver that money to individual landowners. But the state private tribal forestry branch and all of our competitive grant programs, most of that money is for off of the federal lands. Maya might talk about it a little bit more, but in terms of the National Forest System, we also have a number of authorities that allow us to work on lands adjacent to national forest lands. And so a number, particularly around tribes, allow us to use money that can be used for kind of these cross-boundary projects that it has benefits to the national forest if the work is being done kind of outside the boundaries of the national forest as well. So there's lots of opportunities for work outside of the national forest lands.
Thanks, Chris. Maya, anything, or Tasha, anything either of you want to add to that answer?
Yeah, I think Chris got it. There are partnership authorities that allow for work on land adjacent to the forest system, and I'm sure you'll learn more about those authorities and agreements in the next session.
Great. Well, one question that kind of ties together some threads from questions we received from registrants and from one that we have here is just this issue of housing, and that being a really big challenge for Forest Service staff, as well as just National Forest System adjacent communities, rural communities. Do you all have funding streams and or opportunities around provision of housing? And if you want to talk about that from kind of a partnership or funding perspective, that would be great. And if you want to mention anything the Forest Service is doing internally around housing provisions, that would be great.
You want me to take that one? I can take a stab at that one. One of the things that we are seeing, and it's a fairly large challenge right now that we have as an agency, is a lot of our staff are located in really amazing places to live. So our national forests are some of the most beautiful lands and most amazing places in the country. With that means lots of folks want to live there. And because they're in some of these really amazing places. There's often limited housing. And so we have our wages as a Forest Service employee are set by kind of the federal scales. And that those don't necessarily always take into account kind of the actual cost of living in Aspen, Colorado, or Vail, Colorado. I'm in Colorado, so I think of those, but same thing in wherever you are, there's these amazing places that have very high costs of living. And it's a real challenge for a lot of our employees to be able to live, work, and sustain themselves in these communities. We do have opportunities for kind of Forest Service housing, and we're trying to expand those through things. I think there's opportunities for contracts and probably some things that it's probably more on the National Forest System side for a lot of that infrastructure sorts of investments to do that. And we're trying to do a lot of things with our employees in particular. One recent thing that has happened is there's an emergency rebate program that's been approved by the Department of Agriculture through the Forest Service for Forest Service employees that are in federal housing to get a rebate back to help kind of subsidize their housing costs. It doesn't apply to all Forest Service employees and is an imperfect solution at best, but we do recognize it as a challenge. I think if there's a particular place folks are interested in, this is one of those ones where it's going to be very location specific on kind of what they're trying to do, what their resources might be, those sorts of things. And so being in touch with your local Forest Service staff can help you do that. And we probably have less good answers than both we and our communities would like, but we're working through it.
Thanks, Chris. Next up, a question for you, Maya, around the difference between partners, contractors, and cooperators. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so this gets a bit to the definitions. And so I would say we use partners and cooperators somewhat interchangeably depending on the context. If we're talking about a formal partnership, sometimes we call them like capital P partnerships versus the small P partnerships. The capital P partners have a partnership agreement with the agency. And a partnership agreement is different from a contract in the fact that there's cost sharing, there's joint planning, joint development of the project, of the work being done. There's a much higher level of coordination involved versus a contractor. With a contractor, there's some project proposal that's put out and that's bid on by a whole range of people who are interested, or companies, organizations that are interested in doing that specific role. And the project is already set. There's no cost sharing involved. There's no joint planning of the project activity involved. So that's the main difference. With a partner, there's a lot more collaboration involved, whereas contractors, it's a little more of a one-sided relationship.
Great, thanks so much, Maya. We have a question about co-management and co-stewardship, but I think Tasha's rejoining, so I'm gonna switch gears here. And Chris, we had a question about congressionally directed spending and community project funding as other funding streams. Could you explain what those are and how those impact or provide opportunities for the agency?
Yeah, so I talked a little bit about how kind of different administrations have different priorities. In addition to the executive branch administration priorities, Congress has priorities, and they can write those into our appropriations laws or into things like the Farm Bill or different things like that. And so these are things that often folks refer to as earmarks, where they say kind of, you shall spend this amount of money on this particular project in this particular place. And they kind of take that discretionary or competitive piece out of the Forest Service ability, and then we just implement that program as Congress directs us to. So those have to go through the appropriation law process, so they have to be approved by both the House and the Senate and then signed by the president. but Congress can set priorities as well. Sometimes they're not as specific as that. They can be a broader thing where they say, out of this trust fund, spend this amount of money on this sort of work, or it can be written kind of, Congress can write it however they want. There's very few, if no limitations on how Congress can put their priorities in. Sometimes it's informal and they can put it in just kind of the narrative descriptions of the budget law where they say, we want you to spend this amount of money on these things. And how that's written can be more or less directive to us, where we have more or less discretion as well, just from the kind of budget language and the hearings and that sort of stuff. So we kind of try to take all of that into account and kind of follow the desires of Congress to the extent that we can, because ultimately Congress represents you all as the American public, and we work for you. And so kind of when those priorities are expressed either through our executive branch elected officials or our congressional leadership, we try to do that.
Thanks, Chris. We have a few questions around engaging Forest Service staff, kind of who to reach out to. I'm wondering, Maya, if those feel like things you want to answer live or if they could be written. I like that there's a question that we got around just like lessons learned around partnerships that I hope we can get to. But how do you all feel about maybe starting with that one as a meatier question, and then if we can jump back to some of the questions around contacting Forest Service staff, we can do that.
Yeah, I can touch briefly, and I was starting to type a response, but it's difficult. I'd recommend, if you're really having trouble reaching out to your local folks, the inbox that was shared in chat might be a good starting point. It is really best to engage at the local level. It's not often that the national level comes in to, as we mentioned, we're more of a decentralized agency, and I'm curious to know who you've been working with that you're not getting responses from. But I recommend the shared inbox and local channels are usually best for reaching out to folks. So hopefully that kind of covers this question about how to contact different folks. And then I see the question about misconceptions and myths, and then lessons learned. I think biggest lesson learned is that communication is always key. There's often a lot of turnover on both sides, on partner organization sides and Forest Service sides, but having clear communication about goals and transparency about the future of the project and where you hope to go is really helpful. I think that's one of the most common problems we see on our side is someone has dropped the ball somewhere and then there's no recourse for getting back on track. So I think those initial planning meetings are really important to take advantage of, to think about how are we going to communicate going forward? What are our shared goals? How are we going to stay in touch and develop those channels that will outlast staffing changes and vacations and things that come up. So that's a lesson that I would definitely pass on is to be very communicative and open with both with the Forest Service, and Forest Service I think should be doing the same with partners. That's at least from my partnership angle. I'm curious, Chris, if you have any nuggets from the grant side.
Actually, I wonder, Chris, if we could toss it to Tasha just to get her voice in the room. Tasha, are you back with us, and is your sound okay?
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
Okay,
Awesome.
great. So
I wonder,
think that,
yeah, you want to
what?
share kind of lessons learned, especially around partnerships, but maybe with the angle looking at things like co-management, co-stewardship, any lessons learned that you might want to elevate around that sort of work and partnership.
So I think that, just taking a quick stab at this one, communication obviously is going to be central to the work that we do, and understanding what the process looks like and how to work with your local officials. I think that really is mirroring what Maya had indicated earlier. I would actually like to invite my colleague Alicia Bell Sheeter, if she's able to join by audio, to put some nuggets into the room regarding co-stewardship.
Did it work?
Yeah.
It did.
Hallelujah. Right. So lessons learned around effective co-stewardship. I think I caught the beginning of your session today, and it's really around those relationships, right? So if you've got, if you're consulting appropriately and you've built a relationship with tribes, the rest of it comes far, far easier. And absent that, you're going to struggle to get to co-stewardship. And so having that relationship is where you would kick off those negotiations around what you want to do on the landscape. The tribes express their priorities to the line officers and the local staff units to work with them from the very inception. That's really key for tribal, at any rate, and arguably many partners, is being part of that conversation at the planning phase is also another path to ensure success. It's really hard, and I've experienced this over time with the Forest Service. When you come in after the forest plan is written, or the 5-year plan is outlined, or the 5-year research plan is already baked, it's really hard to insert partners, even if you want to, because the die has been cast, the budgets have been finalized, at least for a period of time. And so early and often, we have a thing in OTR we say is, before you put pen to paper, like, sit down and figure out what you want to do together in that partnership. So it really is relationship based, as the partnership office folks well know, and getting in there on the ground floor is gonna be the key to moving forward successfully.
Actually, I have one other piece too I'd like to add to this section, and that's really for those communities, understanding that in addition to the relationship building, is, for us in the Forest Service, recognizing that tribes get so many letters, they get inundated with letters into inboxes. So it doesn't hurt to pick up the phone and call folks and talk to them, start building those relationships, identifying what the priorities are for the tribes. Because oftentimes we lead in with what our own priorities are, and we don't commingle those with what the tribal priorities are. And I think that we would do a lot better by way of project initiation or early planning if we were to do that, and understanding in advance what the priorities are for the tribes. And it looks like, Leisha, I sparked something there. Go ahead.
Well, it just prompted me to think of some other comments I've heard on the tribal side. One of our regular partners over time says the first phone call a new line officer should make is to the tribe. So as you're unpacking your desk and putting out your paperweight and your family pictures, you reach out to the tribes who are have interests on your forest to begin it there. It doesn't have to be formal consultation. It can just be as simple as introducing yourself. Another thing that triggered while Tasha was talking is that there are explicit authorities for tribes that are unique to tribes. And that's where our prototypical co-stewardship authority is the Tribal Forest Protection Act, which does have some limitations in terms of the scope. But that's a good rubric to look at and think about as you're bringing tribes into these conversations, with those cultural considerations, those treaty rights, those reserve rights. And then we can go beyond that. Of course, it's not limited just to TFPA.
Great, thanks so much, y'all. Chris, in 1 minute or less, do you have any myths or misconceptions about partnering with the agency that you might want to address and possibly set the story straight on to round us out here?
I think the only one that I would do that maybe addresses a whole lot of myths and misconceptions is probably just saying that the Forest Service is a human organization. And so we are an organization made of humans that are balancing lots of different things. As we talked about, we have laws, we have a public that doesn't always agree on the best way for us moving forward. We have limitations on staff and authorities and all kinds of different things. And as a human organization, we make mistakes as humans do. I think there's often the sense of the Forest Service as being or the federal government generally as being this big black box thing that is always driving towards particular answers. I think that often is a misperception. We make mistakes. We do all of those things. We juggle and balance a lot of different competing priorities. And we're muddling through, I think is maybe the best way to do that, because we as society are muddling through a lot of these issues. And so there's the saying that kind of never attribute to malice what can be attributed to incompetence. I think it's even broader than that, which is kind of, there's oftentimes the simplest explanation, which is we're just trying to figure it out and we don't have the answers, is probably the right answer as compared to we just don't want to work with you, or we want to do something else, or different things there. And so we're very interested in getting feedback. I think one of the things we try to pride ourselves on is being a learning organization. And that inherently means that we know that we've not been perfect in the past, but we are always trying to do better going forward in the future. And so we can't know how to do better if we don't know about when we've made mistakes or those things as well. So keep holding us accountable, keep talking to us, because I think we do want to try to do better. No one gets into the Forest Service because they want to get rich. We're a very mission-driven organization, and we do it because we love the resources that we steward and the communities that we're trying to serve. And so I think that's a very core part of our agency, is being very driven to that sustainability mission.
Thanks so much, Chris. Okay, awesome. Well, we are coming up on the top of the hour, but I do want to reserve a few minutes as promised for Tess to jump on and give us a brief overview of the Community Navigator Initiative services. We got a lot of questions in the chat about different funding opportunities, and this is the place, this is the initiative to connect folks to those opportunities. So I'm going to share my screen for you, Tess, and hand it over to you.
Thanks, Emery. Hey, everyone. It's so great to see a lot of familiar names in our participant list today and see so many new ones. I know Chris and Emery have mentioned numerous times about the Community Navigator initiative. So I'm going to share a little bit more information about what specifically that is and the implementation partner organizations that you can connect with in order to tap into our services. My name is Therese Duria-Riley. I'm the Community Navigator Initiative Director for Coalitions and Collaboratives. So I work collaboratively with Emery and their Community Navigator initiative through FactNet, and I'll share our other implementation partner organizations as well. But the Community Navigator Initiative is an initiative of the USDA Forest Service, really intended to direct bill and IRA funding to organizations, community-based organizations that have historically been underserved by our federal agencies, including the Forest Service. And so if you go back to that climate and economic justice screening tool, communities in areas that show up in gray, those are the communities that we're really working with to ensure that they get access to this bill and IRA money. So the other organizations that are engaged in the Community Navigator Initiative are IANTA, the American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association, then Coalitions and Collaboratives, which is the organization I work for, Hispanic Access Foundation, First Nations Development Institute, and Federation for Southern Cooperatives, and of course, FactNet, the Watershed Research and Training Center in FactNet that Emery works for. And so I think, David, yes?
Could I pause you? It sounds like the screen might not be sharing correctly.
Okay.
I'm gonna stop sharing and reshare briefly. Apologies for this.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, we've got our PowerPoint. Okay. And I'm gonna go to play from current slide. All right, is that looking okay? Great, thank you.
Wonderful. I wasn't sure if it was set up the other way so that I could see the presenter notes or not. So I didn't realize everyone was seeing what I was seeing. Cool. Yeah, so David put in the chat links to each of our implementation partner organizations, Navigator Initiative landing pages. Each of our organizations have request forms to tap into our services. I'll share a little bit more about those services later. If you don't know what organization you're think would be best to connect with initially, we all work together to ensure that you have access to the full breadth of all of our services. And so don't worry if you should reach out to one organization and it turns out another might have specific programming that is better suited to your needs. We all work together on the back end. So next slide, please. Yeah, so some information about the Navigator services that we provide. First and foremost, of course, is connecting communities with funding and partnership opportunities with the Forest Service. So those competitive grant programs like Community Wildfire Defense Grant, Forest Landowner Support, Forest Legacy. These competitive grant programs, we're able to provide support for you to have assistance in being successful in those competitive grant programs. And we also have some sub-grants that we offer as well that are Bill and IRA money that we're able to have our own processes to grant those out. So please check out information about those, both the grant assistance and grant support through each of our websites because they each look different. Our communities have such amazing visions for the things that they're hoping to do to really support our communities. And so we also provide program development support to really help move forward to making those visions a reality. And so if you're looking for support for subject matter expertise, maybe around wildfire, workforce development, programming, models, things like that, and we're able to help support you meet your big visions. And last but not least, capacity building. So we're nonprofits too, and we know that nonprofit workers are trying to do so much with so little, and so we're able to actually provide additional capacity support in order to meet those visions in a variety of ways. And so each of these look different with each of our organizations, and we're able to partner together should one specific program fit your need, and then another organization's program also couple with that. And so that's all I have for you. I'm going to pass it back to Emery, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Amazing. Thanks, Tess. Well, I'm just going to leave you all with some additional resources. Tess just gave a great overview of the Community Navigators Initiative. Also want to note that FACNet does a lot of work around, again, kind of that community wildfire adaptation. And if that describes you or your work or your interests, we would love to connect with you. We have an amazing blog, as well as just our member network that is available to connect with through the websites listed on this slide. And again, the next sessions in our series are coming up in the next couple of weeks, and we would love to see you there. I think that's it for now, but thank you all so much for coming, and we will be sending out follow-up emails with links and the recording as soon as we can get to it. Thanks, everyone.